All right. I have 1 o'clock on the calendar on my phone, which tells me it is time to get started. So let me call this 6th meeting of the Arkansas Women's Commission to order. I want to first thank our host, Commissioner and Senator Breanne Davis, for bringing us here together in Russellville. And I want to thank Arkansas Tech University for welcoming us here, for actually offering to host here. And so we really appreciate the warm welcome that we've had. For those of you who drove in today, you might have been greeted by campus police, which was a actually wonderful experience because there were new students or first day students taking parking spots. So really appreciate the hospitality the university has extended to us today. And then I also just want to note, we have 2 gentlemen in the room that are going to be behind the scenes, but making sure that we sound and look good. So Jeremy May and Noah Delashaw on our staff in the governor's office have always done great support for us behind the scenes. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I want to remind our guests and participants that the meeting is open to the public. To make our meetings as accessible as possible, this is being live streamed via YouTube and will be archived on our website, women.arkansas.gov. Just a housekeeping note also, if you will make sure when you comment that you're using that microphone in front of you, that will make sure that the people who are participating virtually and that what we have in our archive will be captured exactly how you want to be heard. So please make sure you use your microphone. And we'll have there's a few handed around as well if you wanted to stand up or move around the room. So at this time, Senator Davis, is there anything you'd like to say to the group before we turn it over to Tech to welcome us here?
I would just like to second your comments on Arkansas Tech for hosting. I appreciate you guys just being so willing to help put all this together and ensure that we had everything we needed to have this meeting. And thank you all for coming. You guys are all here because you're female leaders in our community, and I appreciate all of you and value you. So thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you, Senator. I also want to recognize Stephanie Duffield, who is the chair of the Board of Trustees for Arkansas Tech University. Thank you for your service to the state and to the university. And I want to ask Dr. Mary Gunter on behalf of the President's office to give her welcome as well.
My name is Mary Gunter. I'm Chief of Staff at Arkansas Tech, and on behalf of Dr. Robin E. Bowen, our president, who is unable to be with us today due to an illness, we want to extend our welcome to you and our appreciation that you chose Arkansas Tech to host this most important discussion to our state and to the work of this commission. You have joined us for the 113th session of Arkansas Tech as we welcomed our students. So thank you for being here to welcome them and us as we begin our semester with students. Arkansas Tech has a president and a board of directors that are very visionary. Our vision for Arkansas Tech is where students succeed, innovation thrives, and communities flourish. And many of you around here, both here from Russellville and those of you that I know from outside this area, are our partners. And we flourish when our partners work together. So to partner with the commission today to host this is very important to us. And we want to welcome you at any time that you have an opportunity. Come back and be with us, spend some time, and we'll take you on a tour of our campus. So again, thank you for being here and welcome.
Congratulations on 113 years. Okay, wonderful. We'll get started now on the business of the meeting. So draft minutes for our last meeting were sent to the commissioners for review a few weeks ago. So at this time, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the minutes from our last meeting on July 15th. So moved. Thank you, Beverly.
Second.
Thank you, Gayatri. Without objection, the minutes from the July 15th meeting are adopted. Is there any old business that we need to take back up for discussion? Great. So at this time, I'd like to invite representatives from each of our subcommittees to briefly update the commission on their work since our last meeting. I say briefly every time the work of the committees, I'm so impressed by what is going on behind the scenes and in the interim meetings. I know that these can be longer, but I just invite y'all to give an update to the commission and to our guests here. And we'll start, as we always do, with the subcommittee on research and writing.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sharice Jones Branch here at Arkansas State University. Thank you very much, Allison. Allison Todd Shields, my co-chair, and I met, I guess, a few days ago to talk about the questionnaire, the survey as it stands right now. We went through some of the questions and clarified some things. So at this point, we are just waiting for some of the other committees to deliver their questions to us. I believe we've already got questions from the COVID-19 committee and Kathy Lloyd's committee, and now we're just waiting to get the rest of the questions so we can review the draft again and get the survey submitted in a timely fashion so we can get some feedback.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll move on to the subcommittee on barriers to entry and retention. Dr. Lloyd, who's the chair of that subcommittee, is actually pulled away to another business matter. She may join us shortly online, but in the interim, Dr. Childers is going to deliver that report.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you for members of the committee and also for the opportunity to provide our report on from the subcommittee on the barriers to entry and retention. Our committee has been very busy as we have worked to pull together our report and submit our report to Chief of Staff Allison so that she can review what we have collected and prepare to send that to the research and writing committee. So I'm happy to say that our report has several sections. Those are on, as I flip through the report, those are on STEM, hunger, single mothers, entrepreneurs, and mentoring. And so in each of these sections, we addressed each of the sections that that were provided to us to go into an introduction, the contributing factors, the outcomes, solutions, and recommendations, and then also looking at the policies around that subject and what research that we gathered that supports those policies or recommendations. And so we still have several reports that we need to review as part of our further analysis on our policy recommendations. However, we went ahead and submitted the report so that we could ensure that the committee had our information, that we could elaborate on the areas and do further work if needed. But then most importantly, give us a little bit of breathing room and time so that we could look at what we needed to research and come up with any policies that were applicable in Arkansas. So we still have a little bit of work to do, but I expect to work with our committee in the next couple of weeks to make those recommendations as to what I have observed or what I've pulled from the research. And then our committee will meet again in order to determine if those recommendations are things we want to bring forward to the research and writing committee and to the as a whole for this group from our commission. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, and then we're going to move on to the impacts of COVID-19 subcommittee. Melly Bridewell, our chair of that committee, had a sudden death, unexpected death in a family friend recently. So I'm going to invite Beverly Morrow to give that report.
My one. So at the beginning of our research, we realized that the area was too broad to address everything. So the committee on a whole, we decided to address the impact of COVID on mental and behavioral health, decrease in women's healthcare services, especially in rural Arkansas, lack of domestic violence support services during the pandemic, lack of childcare services during the pandemic, and personal and family isolation due to the pandemic. So all of the research has been downloaded into Google Docs, and we're in the process of getting all the information in the required format to hopefully send in by the end of September. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beverly. And then we'll move on to the Subcommittee on Family Caregiving. Gayatri.
Thanks, Allison. So as a friendly reminder, members of this subcommittee are Senator Davis, along with myself, Marie, Heather, and Dr. Salazar. So we have had a flurry of activity. We've had a number of guests come in and speak with us about different aspects of family caregiving. One of the challenges we've tried to take up is how to balance the definition of family caregiving. And so I think I had reported out on this, but we'll circle back to say again and reaffirm that we've chosen to really put about 90% of the subcommittee's energy into child care as a subset of family care, but have not yet had a chance to dig in on elder care and care for family members with disabilities. We will have short sections on each of those, but the lion's share of the research, in part because of the focus of the executive order explicitly asking for the state of the childcare economy in Arkansas, will focus on the aspect of family care that is specific to childcare. And so we've sort of broken that down into 5 key areas. And this is all through the lens of quality of care, affordability of care, and geography of care. So not just asking, is there care, but is it quality care? Where is that care? And can I actually gain access from an economic lens to that care? And so we'll be highlighting 2 key pain points in access to care, which is infant care and school age child care. It's really important for us to understand that Arkansas actually has outstanding pre-K. So if your child is between the ages of 3 and 4, the probability that you can find and afford quality care near where you live is high, which is something we want to highlight as a positive. The same cannot be said about infant care. And because when women are not able to return to the workforce in that first year of their child's life, they tend to stay out longer. It connects directly to the issues of barrier to entry into workforce. So highlighting infant care, highlighting after school care, and then highlighting a need to better understand non-traditional hours care, meaning child care for workers who work outside of 9-to-5 type jobs. What is the current state of that? How is it measured and tracked? And are we meeting the needs of those workers? And then the last 2 sections we'll look at providers of care, types of providers, sort of the state of who is providing that care, how the overall availability of care could be expanded, and highlighting some of the programs that are helping to do that currently and recommendations of how we could do more of that. And then the final section will look at the workers who are providing that care. So our early learning educators or our family caregivers. And I think that's it. We have a lot of writing to do to get to the research and writing committee, and we are aware of the deadline.
Did you have a request for expertise as well?
Thank you, Allison. Thank you so much. So on just a request of everyone who's in the room, if anyone has any recommendations of experts in either the elder care space or disability care space that you could recommend our subcommittee meet with, I would greatly appreciate that. So feel free to grab me after the meeting or just send me recommendations if you have any. That was an area of need that we had.
Very good. So all of the committees have touched on this, but just a reminder, and I've talked to all of the committee chairs, but really starting to wrap up the work that we're doing in the research portion of this commission and starting to get into the deep work of writing for the final report, and that those interim reports from the committees are due to the research and writing committee in about 6 weeks and around October 1st. So just highlight that as an interim deadline for us and for everyone else who is paying attention to us. So just a couple of updates from me. So I mentioned it's time to start thinking about and collating the recommendations of the various subcommittees and what we've heard from our special guests and what we hear in these regional meetings. Aprilla, who I haven't yet introduced, but Aprilla Porch, who many of you have heard from electronically over email, and she does a yeoman's work of following up with folks, making sure we have the right information to get connected. But she's been managing a spreadsheet of recommendations that have come from these conversations with guests like you here today from the various communities, and making sure that if we don't see those recommendations coming from the subcommittee, the relevant subcommittee, that we're at least being purposeful about not including them for some reason. So Pearl has been doing all that great work, and we'll have that to share with you. Of course, over the next few months, we'll be working with the Research and Writing Committee to deconflict any proposed recommendations. So if multiple committees are making the same recommendation, either deconflicting those or making sure that we're getting kind of a consolidated recommendation in the report, and to ensure that we're vetting all of the recommendations before they go into the final report. And then I can't stress this enough. Our goal is for actionable recommendations. And I want to be clear that even though the report is going to go to the governor and to the legislature, I'm looking for recommendations, and I know the governor will be too, recommendations that could be addressed by anyone in the community or certain parts of the community, maybe not just the executive branch and the legislative branch. So I want to encourage the committees to continue to think about that. And then finally, Dr. Jones Branch will be hosting us as the next commission meeting in Jonesboro. That meeting will be on September 14th. And so we thank her in advance. And I'll make sure that we get those final details to you, commissioners, here in the next couple of days. So this is a true joy for me. As I get older, I get more and more appreciative of the friends that I make along the way. And our guest speaker is one of those. So I want to introduce to you, many of you have had a chance to meet her, very personable, and she made her rounds today. So I want to introduce our guest speaker, Governor Michelle Mickey Bowman of the Federal Reserve System Board. And I'll briefly introduce her. And of course, a copy of her bio is at each of your seats as well. But Governor Bowman has been serving as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System since November 26th of 2018. Initially appointed to fill the remainder of an unexpired term in January of 2020, she was reappointed, a dubious honor, I think, and sworn in for a full 14-year term ending January 31st of 2034. Prior to her board appointment, Mickey served as a Kansas State Bank Commissioner from January 17th to November of 2018, before which she was Vice President of Farmers and Drovers Bank in Kansas from 2010 to 2017. Additional past experience included service in the Washington, D.C. office of Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, as counsel to the U.S. House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, as a director at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and where we met in her capacity as a Deputy Assistant Secretary and Policy Advisor to Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge. Following her time in Washington, Mickey led a government and public affairs consultancy in London, where we also had a chance to catch up before returning to Kansas in 2010. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Kansas and a JD from Washburn University School of Law. Mickey is a member of the New York State Bar. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Mickey Bowman, and open it up for your comments.
So much for you for serving on this commission. And is that better? Okay. But thanks so much for all of you for participating in this incredibly worthy project and commission work. It was such a pleasure to meet each one of you before we started this meeting today, and to learn from you what you're doing and what you're prioritizing in your work to bring women and your communities into economic success and growth and thriving communities, which is so important and so close to my heart and the work that I've done throughout my life and tried to continue at the board. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be among such accomplished women who are bringing such expertise and deep knowledge, especially you, Allison, to this endeavor and to this group of people. And it's really a privilege to be invited to share my perspectives on things that I've been working on since joining the Federal Reserve Board, and just my perspective throughout being a woman in the workforce. So I'll just jump in if that's all right. So first, it's just really a sincere pleasure to be here with you today. I'm excited to talk about something that I experience directly, as each one of you do every day, which is women's workforce participation. So I come to this issue with a similar perspective as you all do. I'm from a heavily rural state in a small farming and ranching community deep in the Flint Hills of Kansas. but I also have roots here in Arkansas. I don't know that you knew that. My husband's family is from Hardy. There's apparently a hill named Bowman Hill, namesake. And then he has family in Conway as well. But my father's mother was from Little Rock. So we used to spend a great deal of time when I was a child during holidays coming to Little Rock to visit here. And having spent the last few days or day and a half in Little Rock, it has experienced such an incredible renaissance since that time in the 70s. I have to be honest, that was when I spent the majority of my time here. But it's so wonderful to see the progress that Arkansas is making, has always made. And I spoke at a FinTech event this morning with the Venture Center. Leadership that comes from this state on so many different levels is incredibly inspiring. So very, very excited to be able to be here finally. Your bank commissioner, Susanna Marshall, has been trying to get me to come since before the pandemic, since we've known each other since I was also a bank commissioner. Finally, now that everyone's traveling again, it's really a privilege to be able to be here in person. And I'm just excited that I could add this to my event schedule today. So I'm really honored. But my husband and I returned home to Kansas in 2009. We had 2 children under the age of 3. And just as the impacts of the last financial crisis were really making their way to the rural areas across the country. And at that time, I was a community banker, which means that I was also very active in my community. And as I'm sure many of you saw at that time, I saw firsthand the impacts of the recession and the increased drug and opioid use that devastated so many rural communities in the Midwest, including my community in Kansas. And at that time, many in the community received benefits from well-intended programs that were created to provide assistance, which often made it very difficult for small employers to find employees. This was often because, as I learned when trying to hire employees at our local Chamber of Commerce, as I know one of you is the director of the Chamber of Commerce here, the benefit from taking a job was much less than the benefit that they could receive from the government at that time while not working. It was more expensive for them to work for us than it was to maintain the status quo. And that's one major similarity between the current experience and the last recession. Except that in this episode, the benefits that so many people received were far in excess of what they could earn from working. So much so that the benefits provided to a large number of Americans resulted in a significant increase in savings, which is only recently beginning to decline and is likely leading many who had not yet decided to re-enter the workforce to find work. These labor supply problems, as I'm going to talk about throughout my discussion today, are a large part of women's experience in the workforce since the pandemic. And the lesson from this and other recessions is that policymakers need to carefully think about and weigh all of the consequences and unintended consequences of their decisions. It's fair to say that the majority of the economic conditions we're experiencing today, like inflation, are different from those of the last financial crisis. But as I just noted, there are some similarities in the impacts on the labor force. Turning to the subject of my remarks today, I'll discuss the role of women in the U.S. economy, focusing on the period since the onset of COVID-19. You may already know that women suffered disproportionately more job losses than men during the pandemic. This was the opposite of what's happened in past recessions when men lost their jobs at a higher rate. The difference this time has led some to call the 2020 downturn a she-cession. It's kind of a dubious honor, but most of the differences between how men and women fared in the labor market during that time had reversed by 2021. But their different experiences highlight how participation by men and women can sometimes be driven by different forces. The backdrop of recent events is the long history, starting after World War II, of women gradually entering the labor market. Of course, women had always significantly contributed to and played a large role in the U.S. economy, but initially in ways that didn't show up in most government statistics. The rise of industrialization and the shift away from an agrarian economy provided opportunities for men to work outside the home. So women took on more responsibility, cooking, sewing, child rearing, and other domestic tasks. We heard an echo of that history during the pandemic. Because when schools closed and other childcare was disrupted, women assumed the majority of those caregiving responsibilities, which led many to quit their jobs and drop out of the labor force. This magnified the effect by eliminating jobs in childcare and resulting in even more unemployment. But that wasn't the only reason why women were more impacted during this episode. So let me start with the big picture on the differences between men and women in the labor market. Before 1950, few women worked outside the home, and the majority of those who did were not married. From 1950 to 1970, more women entered the workforce, but many didn't plan to work for a long period of time, and their investment in education and training was often limited. But by the mid-1970s, barriers that limited women's opportunities in workplaces began to fall. And by 1990, the education gap between men and women had narrowed significantly. Women's participation steadily increased until the gains leveled off in the 1990s, but then rose again from 2015 to 2020, just before the pandemic. This narrowing of educational attainment for men and women had a lot to do with the narrowing of participation rates over the decades. And today, women are more likely than men to hold a bachelor's degree, which I'm sure, Mary, you are already aware of. But even so, before the pandemic, overall participation remained lower for women than men, regardless of education level. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic caused the most abrupt decline in employment in the history of this country. The lockdowns and other government restrictions on businesses severely limited work, education, and travel. In February 2020, over 60% of working age people had a job or were looking for work. But by April, it was closer to half that. The pandemic hit all sectors hard, but the toll was particularly heavy on in-person, close contact service industries, restaurants, hotels, airline travel, and retail businesses, of course, except for the big box stores and pharmacies and grocery stores. These in-person service industry jobs were considered more conducive to spreading COVID-19. They were more affected by government mandated shutdowns and social distancing, and teleworking was generally just not possible. But unlike in any previous recession, the downturn in unemployment fell more heavily on women than on men. The unemployment rates for men and women were essentially the same before the pandemic, but they ended up much higher for women. And that was very different, as I mentioned, from past recessions. For example, the recession following the last housing crisis, the unemployment for prime age men, which is 24 to 50, I think is the range, somewhere close to that, rose to 11% compared to only 9% for women. But the labor force participation rate for women is another way to measure their presence in the workforce. So women have made significant progress in closing the gap with men since the 1960s, including the 5 years before the pandemic. But that gap reopened after the onset of the pandemic. The number of both prime working age men and women in the labor force plunged, but the drop was 500,000 more for women than it was for men. From what we know now, there appear to be two main reasons why the pandemic downturn affected more women than men. First, after the dramatic employment gains over the past 50 years, women are still most often the primary caregivers to children and other family members. They shouldered most of the childcare burden from COVID-19 school closures. And second, a higher proportion of women worked in and continue to be employed in professions that have high contact service sectors that were hit hardest by the pandemic. Caregiving burdens in the United States have always fallen more heavily on women. In the 20 years before the pandemic, roughly a fourth of prime age women with children didn't participate in the workforce. An even larger share of women with children under 5 were primarily engaged in childcare. Many women with children tend to cycle in and out of employment based on their family's childcare demands. Women are significantly affected by summer childcare burdens if they have children. Each year between May and July, when schools close for the summer, the employment to population ratio for prime age women declines by more than a percentage point, and then it rebounds when schools reopen in the fall. That difference is 1/3 of the total drop that prime-age women experienced following a very bad recession like the one after the housing crisis in the late 2000s. Today, working women still carry out most of the childcare responsibilities. And one study conducted before the pandemic found that when both parents work, women spend 50% more time on childcare than men. And when the pandemic closed many schools, it was largely women who stayed home. Women with children saw their labor force participation rate and employment to population rate fall more than for women without children, while men were much less effective regardless of whether they had children. According to one Federal Reserve study, increased caregiving burdens for mothers with school-aged children accounted for about 3/4 of the decline in the labor force from February 20 to August of 2021, but only about 1/3 of the decline for fathers. Even after most children returned to in-person schooling, caregiving continues to weigh on female participation in the labor force, likely because of the increased care for elderly or ill family members. The other factor affecting women during the pandemic was the larger number of female employees in high-contact service sector jobs, which I mentioned earlier, where demand dropped sharply during the pandemic and the restrictions that were imposed in response to COVID-19. But during past recessions, women experienced fewer job losses because service sector jobs were more stable in downturns. Historically, goods-producing industries were harder hit, and men who tended to hold those roles were more likely to lose their jobs. But during the pandemic, it was the opposite. Before that time, more than 75% of these workers were women. Between February 2020 and April 2020, service sector employment fell 40%. Job losses in other industries with greater proportions of male workers, like manufacturing, were much smaller. We've also seen recovery in service sector jobs lag behind other sectors. Employment in industries that tend to have larger shares of female workers, such as leisure and hospitality, education, and health services, is still below pre-pandemic levels. The losses for women are even larger when considering how fast these industries were growing before the pandemic started. We're all seeing a shift to remote work, and that may have been a mitigating factor for employment for women without college degrees. Overall, workers without college degrees were hit particularly hard by the pandemic because remote work was much less common. But women without degrees were affected less than men, probably because their jobs were more able to be performed remotely than for those men without college degrees. So we've seen a substantial recovery in the labor market for both genders since the worst of the pandemic. By the end of 2020, unemployment rates had equalized, and the gap between gender participation rates had returned to pre-pandemic levels in 2021. However, because the gap had been narrowing in the 5 years prior to the onset of COVID-19, we can assume that the participation gap likely would have continued to decrease over that time. So based on what we know now and what we know about the history of recent experiences, what do we think the future holds for working women? On the demand side, the labor market continues to be extremely strong, and there are many job opportunities for workers of all education and skill levels. We still have about 4 million people out of the workforce since before the pandemic. And there are still plenty of jobs available, even if we see the number of job openings reduced. We're also seeing a larger number of women graduating from college than men, a development that's likely to ensure women against job losses in future recessions. One complication to all of this is that the future of the labor supply is uncertain. It's difficult to predict how labor force participation will evolve. Factors like generational aging were already weighing on labor supply before the pandemic, and we saw millions of workers accelerate their retirements during the pandemic, effectively retiring early. Even the strong labor market has not yet lured many of these retirees back. And some believe that as time passes, it will become less likely that they will return. But over time, those who chose to leave the workforce will move into a normal retirement age and sort of drop out of the calculation of the statistics. But we really don't know if gender will be a factor, since this is the first generation to retire that had a large number of women in the workforce. But workforce aging is an important consideration when it comes to labor supply. We also don't know how the influence of inflation will affect decision-making about returning to the workforce. But some may feel compelled to return to work, especially as I noted before, and in speaking with a group of bankers last night, with all of the pandemic programs that we saw, the savings rate and the deposit rates at many financial institutions and community banks is really what I keep a really close eye on. But what we're hearing now is that these savings are becoming depleted. So the account balances in many of these smaller institutions are seeing directly the impacts of inflation on people who have deposit accounts with them. And we're hearing that, you know, anecdotally with the additional increases in expenses for regular necessities, like some average between $400 and $700 a month for families with the increase in prices related to inflation. But back to labor force participation, another consideration that we're looking at is caregiving demands and how those responsibilities are going to be shared in the future within the households. And while I hope that we never see a public health emergency like the one that we've just been through, I hope that if we do, we can avoid the governmental decisions to intentionally disrupt foundational education. As I was speaking with one of you about the importance of early childhood education and education going forward. I think it was Dr. McDonald. So that we don't disrupt foundational education and isolate children unnecessarily. I think these policies are going to leave a significant impact on this generation of children, on families and their decision-making about many things, including participation in the workforce. I know one of you was giving a report on the committee earlier about mental health. I think it was Ms. Morrow at the end of the table. I think it is a real issue and something that I'm very concerned about. I have a 13-year-old daughter. It's a hard time to be 13. It's an even harder time when you can't go to school or you're isolated. But another ongoing labor supply issue relates to the lingering effects of COVID. And those lingering effects can interfere with the ability to work or impose additional caregiving needs for family members. By one account, nearly a fifth of adults who contracted COVID reported ongoing symptoms of long COVID, affecting significantly more women than men. At the same time, the number of working age people with disabilities has increased significantly. While the number of Americans reporting a disability had been rising gradually over the past decade, the increase picked up in mid-2020 and added about 2 million more people reporting that they had a disability in July of 2022. 2 million more than at the outset of the pandemic. Disability has been a major drag on the workforce in rural areas in the past, as I'm sure all of you have seen in Arkansas, just as we saw it in Kansas. Living in rural Kansas following the last recession, I'm very familiar with the challenges that disability presents for many aspects of the community beyond just economic conditions. Women's labor force attachment in Arkansas is below the national average. I'm sure you know that as well. In the 5 years before the pandemic, about 72% of prime age women here were either working or looking for work, compared to 75% nationally. The difference in labor force participation is primarily explained by illness or disability and existed long before the onset of COVID. So this is a long-standing problem and issue that many rural areas have faced. There's really no magic wand that's going to draw workers back into the labor force, especially when we have well-intended, generous government benefit programs that are provided to those who are capable of working. But as challenging as these issues are to address, there are some lessons to draw from the experience and research regarding approaches that encourage people to work. So research suggests that assistance programs, including job search assistance, training programs, and private sector employment subsidies increase the likelihood of employment by up to 10% for those who utilize the programs. And while the benefits of these programs aren't immediately realized necessarily, women are more likely to benefit from these private sector programs and job training programs. So in conclusion, although we still have about 4 million people out of the pre-pandemic workforce, we continue to see strong employment gains and low unemployment rates, the kind of labor market that has historically pulled in more workers. And as the service sector continues to recover and schools and childcare establishments open more fully, I see potential for greater employment opportunities for women in the future. Obviously, economic conditions are going to affect those job opportunities going forward. And today's high on inflation and strong employment will likely create some pressure on labor and employment. But in closing, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and share my thoughts about labor force participation and women's workforce presence. It's really a privilege for us to be able to share the work that we do at the Federal Reserve with you as a part of the work that you're doing here. Thanks so much, Allison.
Thank you. So we have just a couple of minutes for some questions. So if you'll indulge us a little bit, I'm going to turn over the opportunity for the first question to our host commissioner, Senator Davis.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There was a lot of really good information in that. While we know COVID has adversely impacted Americans across the country, we're also seeing areas of positive impact, like telehealth, which had some pre-adoption or some adoption pre-COVID in some states, but was long overdue in Arkansas. I was glad that we were able to get that done. But things that accelerated rapidly during the pandemic or new, more flexible models of employment. Are there other positive outcomes the Fed would point to? And if so, what do you recommend that we as individuals, as citizens, as governments do to maintain that momentum?
Well, that's a really great question. And that's something that we think about a lot. What's leading to people either coming back to the workforce or still staying out of it. And we understand that a lot of people really enjoyed and appreciated the opportunity to get a little bit better work-life balance, whether through the opportunity for remote work a few days a week or more permanently. And I think it's had a positive impact on the workforce, but maybe less of a positive impact on businesses more generally, because it's very difficult to bring people on board and establish a culture when you have people working remotely and not having the opportunity to have to facilitate discussions that might be impromptu, that you would have the opportunity to do if you were in person and could just pop over to your friend's desk and say, I was thinking about this. Do you have a question? That you might not be willing to pop a Zoom open or, pick up the phone to call to ask a silly question. That might not be silly, but you might think it was and not worth your time to do that. So I think one area that we've seen that development is in remote working. This telehealth thing has been fantastic. My family has really appreciated that. I know that there were a lot of legal barriers to that prior to the pandemic that were eliminated as a result. I hope that that continues. I think that provides better access to healthcare for all people. And I think that that's been a very positive development. Another thing that I think that we've seen is a shift towards self-employment and gig employment. So it's a different model of work than we've seen traditional employment, and we may not be able to capture that in our statistics when we're looking at who's sitting out of the workforce. Are they really unemployed? When I talk about the 4 million people that we know that are no longer participating in the workforce, are they doing some contract work or just doing a couple of projects here and there? And they're still contributing in that way to the workforce, but not in a technically measurable way. So those are a couple of things that.
You can keep that one. I'll take
Oh,
this.
thanks.
Okay, we're going to go virtually to Dr. Jones Branch. I think you had a question as well.
Yes, thank you, Governor Bowman, for your comments. I really appreciated them. My question actually has two parts. Do you have workforce participation data for various sectors of the economy? And are there any new or emerging trends in sectoral workforce development, and how might this impact women?
That's a great question. And I came prepared with some statistics. So if you'll indulge me for just a minute, I think we are continuing to see, as I mentioned in my remarks, an ongoing gap in leisure and hospitality employment versus pre-pandemic. The women prevalent in this workforce women are most prevalent in the workforce. So we expect further recovery from the pandemic conditions and more normalization of businesses and other activities, which I'm guessing you're pretty much back to normal here in Arkansas. But most part, the part of the country that I live in, it's taken us a little bit longer. So that would be an expectation that we would see some more recovery in that area. You may be seeing things like restaurants limiting their hours because they can't get enough employees. We're seeing that across the country too. You're also seeing that when you're taking a vacation. There just aren't enough people to work to fully staff up in different areas. So I have some information from the BEA on sector differences and by age and by gender. Over the past year, workers aged 20 and above, the employment for men has grown by 3.7% or 2.9 million jobs, and women's has grown by 3.5% or 2.4 million jobs. In professions like management, business, and financial operations, it's grown by 2.3 million jobs for men, but only 1.2 million jobs for women. In service occupations, we've seen the growth for men at 200,000 jobs, but it's declined for women by 44,000. Among healthcare support jobs, while jobs among men remain the same, women's declined 60,000 jobs. Another big difference is in food service. We've seen a growth for men at 279,000, but no growth for women, stayed flat. Another interesting observation is that women have left 140,000 jobs in sales, and roughly 800,000 have joined the workforce with office and administrative support jobs. But 85,000 men have joined sales jobs and 300,000 have joined similar administrative and business support jobs. So one thing that I mentioned earlier that may impact the workforce and opportunities and development is I mentioned opioids earlier, and being from a small community, that's been something that I've tracked closely. So it might be interesting for you to know that 20% of the observed decline in labor force participation among prime age men, and I couldn't get this split out for women, between 1999 and 2015, 20% of the labor force left because of that particular issue. It's 3.5 million jobs nationwide. So that's a big impact. And hopefully we're seeing that since there's more awareness of it and maybe less decline. But I think in times of recession where sometimes money is plentiful, we often see a lot of activity in rural areas with not even prescription drugs, but other types of drug activity. So I would expect that we'll need to probably watch carefully to see how that evolves or how it did evolve, if you're aware of that over the next few years, just to kind of have a better understanding of what the impacts of that are.
Great, thank you. And then I think we just have time for one more question, and Dr. Salazar, also joining us virtually, had one for you.
Well, good afternoon, Governor Botman. So what is the recommendation that you might have for communities or maybe the governments to do in order to reverse the downward workforce participation trends for women? That's my first question. And my follow-up question is, do you have any success stories from other states or communities that you can share with us?
I think to be able to give you a recommendation, I mentioned in my remarks that we've seen a lot of progress associated with programs like job training, workforce development, those kinds of opportunities that help people prepare for the workforce that I think have been shown to be successful, making more investments in those, identifying specific job skills and things like that you can share within your communities. Oftentimes there are educational facilities within small towns and different communities that can provide that kind of skills development directly to their communities without having to travel to go take advantage of those programs. So offering those things directly within those communities that might not have already had some sort of structure for that would probably be incredibly beneficial. Finding partners within those communities would be something that you might find some benefit from. I think that a lot of things that we're hoping to find some evolution in, and things that you're working on are the childcare and those kinds of things as they evolve more and they provide more opportunities for women to work outside the home because that childcare is more available. I think that's going to make a big difference. I think that's holding a lot of families back from returning to the workforce. I think I talked about a lot of these other things already, but I don't think we have a magic wand or a perfect answer. It's really just trying to identify skills gaps, trying to help people be prepared for the workforce and giving them the opportunity to have the resources they need in order to break down the barriers for their ability to either rejoin or get back into the workforce or join the workforce. So good luck with what you're doing. I am confident you will come up with some excellent opportunities and ideas, and I look forward to seeing them as they develop.
Wonderful. Well, we'll make sure that you get a copy of the final report as well. But would y'all join me in thanking Dr. We have Dr. Bowman also. Yeah, Governor Bowman. Thank you. All right, so we're going to move on to, honestly, no offense intended, my favorite portion of these meetings, which is getting to hear from the women in the communities where we are being hosted. And so I'll be asking everyone at the table, well, maybe minus the commissioners, but also welcome your personal comments too, if you like. Just how you've experienced some of these things that we'll talk about. And Jeremy, if you could also just put that slide up. Perceived barriers that you face in various aspects of your life. This is directly related to the governor's charge to us in the executive order. What are we finding? What are you experiencing in your own personal lives and in your families about these various things? And I will read a lot of this. So if you can't read it on the screen, I can help there. And so just again, if you're going to speak, please remember to speak into the microphone so we can capture that. And I just ask that if you're speaking, that you speak from your own experience. Use I statements. We want to try to avoid generalizing maybe what you've experienced or what you perceive others have experienced. We want to make sure we're capturing what you yourself have experienced. So ground rules out of the way. Any questions about that? And I don't mind calling on people by names. That's why you have names. That's why you have names. So. But I do hope that we can make this, I mean, we're a pretty small group here, just to make this as informal and as conversational as possible. We have heard from hundreds of women already. Dr. Jones Branch mentioned a survey that we're doing that will go out to thousands of women in Arkansas to collect their experiences. And so your voice will be added to that and may, if you, and not for attribution, but may be included as call out boxes in some of our report, because we want to talk about what are we experiencing when we hear from the community, and then what are some specific experiences that we're hearing from each of you. So we've heard from Governor Bowman about what the Fed is experiencing, what they're reviewing and seeing in their research on barriers to entry, particularly for the workforce. And so for those of you at the table and hear from the community, can you talk a little bit about the impact and barriers that you've seen either because of COVID or even before that in entering the workforce or building a business or something that is outside of the home related to the work that I know we all do every day? Who wants to go first? Yeah. Let me grab this microphone. Okay, you're gonna walk around. All right, and Aprilla will help get a microphone around to you too. Thank you, Aprilla.
I'm Christy Graham and I do tourism for the city of Russellville. And so instantly when we shut down, major things are gone. The good thing is the current AMP, can you hear me?
Oh, it may not be on.
Hello? The main thing that the commission tried to do is we were well prepared. We were in a financial state that we could go the extra mile and spend the extra money. Whereas some of the other AMPs in the state were we weren't in that predicament. So we went after a lot of extra business to try to help our hotels. And the minute that our mayor opened our city parks and things like that, we went after every softball tournament, everything we could go after, and all in effort to keep our hotels open. And so we were able to kind of be really aggressive and to go after that and turn it. And I was sharing earlier with you, post-COVID, we had our largest year that our current AMP has had in the history of Russellville. So we worked really hard and we tried to turn it, and we had to go after new ideas. We had to get creative, but we did that, and we did not lose one hotel here. So
That's really outstanding. Yeah, and I think Senator Davis's question kind of went to this. Like, we hear all the time about what negative impacts COVID had on everyone, as Americans, but also just here in Arkansas. And there are things that are so positive about that, new business models or new ways of approaching existing challenges. And so I love that you brought up something about being resilient and being able to address that. How about something more personal? Somebody, even going back to your 20s. Those of us who can remember being in our 20s. I know y'all all can. But what was it? What did you experience when you were coming into the workforce that maybe now you look back and you think, well, that just seems unfair, or I don't know anyone else who experienced that?
I feel really lucky. When I graduated from pharmacy school, I applied for the residency and I got that. And then I moved down to St. Thomas, one of our Virgin Islands, and got the job there. And now I'm home working at my family pharmacy. So I feel very fortunate that the job path that I took has always needed more pharmacists, women hired just as much as men. And hopefully that trend will continue. So I can't think of anything that would lend to that answer.
Well, what drew you to pharmacy in the first place?
Family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had role models.
Yes.
Yeah. And was your mother also a pharmacist?
My father was.
Mm-hmm. So a good role model father who ensured that you were part of learning how to do the family business.
Yes. Well, he passed away when I was young. So it was my mother who always had me down at the pharmacy, making sure that I knew that without question, I was qualified to do that. Push yourself. You're capable of doing anything that you put your mind to. I think that, I could have done anything.
Mm-hmm.
I just went that direction because I knew that field was fabulous for both women and men, and you could go anywhere to do it. That's what helped me make that selection with what I did with my life.
And
Job security.
You sure?
I'm in passion for helping people. It's not what I said.
But and when you were in pharmacy school, how was the class pretty evenly split between men and women?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, it was majority men, and then it shifted to more women. And then when I was there, it was about equal.
Good. Does anybody have any experience where they completely went away from, Yancey was in the family, had a family, was in the business, went the family business, so to speak. Anybody have something where they just went a completely direction from expectations that your parents had, expectations that you had of yourself? Nikki, did you think you were going to be governor of the Federal Reserve Board?
Michael. This job didn't even exist when I was a community banker. Wasn't created a specific role for someone with community banking or state bank commissioner experience until 2014. I moved home from London and became a community banker because it was what my family did. And I wanted to be a part of our family business and our farm and a ranch. And you work hard as women. You always feel like you have to work harder than men or your colleagues. And if you want to succeed, you just do. Right. And I think sometimes that opens doors. We also had a passion for helping women enter public service. As you know, we just don't have enough female perspective in those kinds of roles. And there's so many women in communities that just don't feel qualified to serve on the school board or on the city council or those kinds of things. So I got involved with a women's group when I was in Kansas in my spare time as a banker to help bring women and train them about how to participate, how to help shape their communities and do those kinds of things. And through that, I think you just make relationships and you have opportunities and you can either say yes or no. And I always said I didn't want to regret saying no. I wanted to explore whatever opportunity was in front of me. So.
Thank you. Dr. Gunter, was your family in education and higher education?
No, as a matter of fact, I'm a first gen high school as well as first gen college. I had a great niece with me this weekend. She's starting 3rd grade, and to talk about the entry of women into professions in our workforce. I didn't ask her, what do you want to be when you grow up? I just said, are you ready for school? And she said, yes, and I want to be a dog sitter. And I said, talk to me more about that. Now, her father is a surgeon and her mother is a radiologist. So I'm thinking, I can't wait to break this news to them. I said, now, I know we all love animals in our house, but what about training? Have you ever thought about training animals? Maybe, and I started talking about some of the opportunities out there associated with animals and people who have kennels, and people are taking to board their dogs, professionals. And she said, yes, and I think I want to be a child psychologist. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. I said, how did you know about that? Well, I'm good about helping people solve their problems. So the next thing you know, we've got a nice boarding kennel. She's a child psychologist. She's training animals that will be therapy dogs. But I said to her, I only had one choice, and that was education. I didn't know I could do anything else. We were either, as you say, women are still in service industries, education, nursing, maybe childcare. I didn't know I could be anything but really in education. So this young girl can make connections and be whatever she wants. And that's the message when we look at our children about how we enter those women into those discussions.
And when you were growing up, you said first generation high school graduate, which I have some of those in my family as well. So what gave you the courage to continue on, or the ability, maybe your family, your parents did not have the financial stability in order to finish their high school?
Well,
What gave you
back-
that opportunity?
It goes back to our public schools and that key, we all say, who made the difference? It was teachers who could look at me and say, you've got potential, you need to move forward. It was the school counselor who could help navigate the system to help my parents understand, yes, not only could I go to college, I could go out of state and go to a college where I could receive some assistance, but yet hard work, earn your own money, take a loan out, learn the value of money, and go to work.
And did you go out of state for undergrad?
I am a product. I was raised in the Kansas City, Missouri area. I came to Arkansas 50 years ago and have never left.
We love having you here. How about on this side of the table? Danielle? And then I'll come to you.
So, I also came to Arkansas, from Pennsylvania.
Welcome.
I've been here for 12 years. I'm
Good,
comfortable.
good.
Thank you. One thing that I noticed when I came here, we moved here for my husband's employment. He works at Arkansas Tech. He's a professor. And I was fortunate enough to keep my job and work remotely from home. It was a bit of a challenge because I had part-time childcare. So some days I was juggling kids and work, and other days I was doing as much as I possibly could while my kids were out of the house. After I had been with that company for 11 years, so it's been, I guess, 6 or 7 years ago, I was downsized. And one of the difficulties that I had was finding a job that I was qualified for, or rather not overqualified for. I have a bachelor's degree and I also earned a master's degree from Arkansas Tech. And so, I mean, I worked like 4 jobs literally at the same time, 4 part-time jobs. And I was working at a bookstore. I was working as a substitute teacher, as an adjunct professor at 2 different universities, or adjunct instructor, I should say. And so it was very difficult because I was constantly running and juggling everything. And then I really just got very lucky when somebody approached me and said, hey, I think there's a job that's going to be open soon that you would be a great fit for. And so now I'm the executive director of Main Street Russellville, and I love my job. So I feel very fortunate. However, I think there's a lot of women out there that may not be as fortunate as I am.
Yeah, it sounds like the importance of a network that you have. You're doing great work out there, but having to do it 4 times over just to build the network to have someone, come to you with that sort of the things like the deals that used to happen for folks behind closed doors now is you're benefiting from that as well. That's wonderful. Crystal.
Mine's a little, maybe a little different topic. I was thinking about COVID and women and entrepreneurship, and I'm own a business. I've been in the wedding industry for 10 years, which is a very heavy women-led business. You know, photographers, venue owners, caterers, bakers, all these careers. And I know a lot of people in my world right now are stunted and holding their breath because if they want to grow their business and they go to a bank, 2020 is just a big black smudge on their, record. And so bankers are like, come back in a year or 2, and that can be, I think, really hard because if you want to grow or hire more people, you say, well, it was COVID. I didn't have a choice. I lost my, nobody got married. Everybody canceled their wedding and you were out of luck. And then the next year you were hurting because you had to make up the weddings from the year before. And then you can't be in 2 places at once. So you have a lot of people in that world. And I'm sure it's the same way for hotel owners or all those other service industries that I think could grow if they were able to, but they have to essentially just hold their breath and wait to rebuild.
Well, and so how have you navigated that over the last, particularly 6 months as things really start to open back up and people are planning their lives again?
Yeah, I mean, run as hard and as fast as you can.
Have you had to hire other people? Are you in the position where you can hire?
I try to some, and that's probably your hardest point, but I even had a conversation with my husband. I was like, listen, this year it's going to be me sweating it because we got to make it and you got to hit these numbers if we want to grow. So I think you do have to just say it's going to be for a season, but you got to make it up, somewhere.
Yeah, this is something that we hear all the time. I mean, and I just welcome any commissioner's thoughts on this as well. Just what women do in every aspect and facet of our lives to just make it work, right? Like we're the ones putting the extra hours in, which is no offense to our partners, men in our lives, but we're doing the extra legwork. We're putting in the extra hours. We're having to meet those financial goals, and that's just not sustainable. So I hope, to your point, it is for a season and isn't something we see over the longer term. How about you?
I am the CEO of our Chamber of Commerce. So, one second.
I think a lot about young girls in school age in Arkansas Tech, and we have these conversations a lot at the chamber. So locally in Russellville, more heavy manufacturing, like 35 to 40% of our local jobs are Rockline, Tyson, Amcor, ConAgra. And so that's not something like your 3rd grade little girl is going to say, I'd love to grow up and be the HVAC at ConAgra. But how can we just intrigue and engage the younger, that younger generation of women in STEM projects and robotics and things that have transferable skills so that locally, when they do graduate or when they finish high school or college, there is some entry into the manufacturing jobs that are available locally, because those jobs historically are, male filled with men. And so kind of speaking to your experience locally, we have a plethora of jobs out in this industrial park. And so how do we get women out to the industrial park? Because those jobs are great jobs and they're good salaries and they're benefits. And, but probably like your experience, you weren't like, let me see
what's available at Rockline for me? And so how do we connect those dots? And so professionally, that's one of my goals, is to work with local educators and see what can we do? Like if they're programming in 10th grade, can we get a ConAgra panel in there? Or can we get a AmCore, robotics equipment into that classroom so that they have at least some exposure? And can we spark an interest there? But I think that's
So do you see across your peers in the state in particular, where there's an interest in bringing women into these STEM and other manufacturing fields?
Yes, I see a major interest in STEM. And so it's kind of, for me, I think a lot about bridging the gap from like STEM, robotics and things, conversations that are already happening on the educational side over into like local manufacturing. What does that look like?
And that gap is getting
CDL.
smaller and smaller, right? As you get more robotics in manufacturing and vice versa.
Right.
Yes.
We also want them to be able to drive a forklift. Like that's a great skill and it's an upskill. And so it has a lot of the same components as a STEM, some STEM components. So kind of bridging that gap just on the local level to get women out into the manufacturing district, just because so many of our jobs locally are out there.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing this too in conversations, just, if you've got a woman who is running farm operations and now has to buy very expensive, very highly technical hardware that is run by very technical, very advanced software, and you're in the middle of nowhere, how can you train yourself to work on that software so that you can actually make your machine do what you want it to do? So it's a really interesting mix of this high and sort of traditional tech. So yeah,
that's a great point. It's like high-end tech and operational tech. Like how can we merge those? Yeah.
Dr. McDonald?
Well, I need to talk about my journey or my
yes, whatever you like.
When I was in high school, my mother went to college while I was in high school. And then, so we were both she was in her master's program and I was starting college. So in that sense, we kind of were graduates at the same time. And I think that I became a teacher because the small school where I was in high school, that's what you did. You either worked at the bank or you worked at the school or you worked at the farm. And I pretty much had ruled out the chicken houses because that's what I did all day during childhood. And I thought that stuff work. So working with children is just something that I enjoyed. As I went into education, I thought with each different part of my journey, I just kind of wanted to expand and be able to help more people. And I thought moving from the classroom to building or district level position allowed me to be able to work with more programs and systems to allow people to understand more about what they can be, and not just based on your interests. Because I think sometimes I thought I was good at something because that was something I was good at school. And maybe I just connected with that teacher and that was something that was easy for me to do, rather than really look at my aptitudes of what might go good with this career or this path. So I think that has kind of carried over into my work with the schools, because I want people to know not only what are you interested in, but what are you good at? And if you want to go to school for 1 year, then these are some viable options that you can do, that you can be independent and have the income that you desire. But if you want to go to school for 10 years, this is what you can do too. But to be able to not have a barrier or a constraint, but to have more knowledge. And I guess, I do feel knowledge is power. So being able to give families that same knowledge so that collectively they can work with their children to see what's important to them. What do they value?
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see across the country, and I know certainly here in Arkansas, the governor has been very committed to a 4-year degree is great, but it is not the only way to get a good paying job, to get skill sets, to return to or to totally jump into a different career field. And so having those various levels, like you said, whether it's 1 year or 10 years of maybe a certification or going all the way for a PhD, where do you fit into that spectrum and your interest in your field? That's right. Yeah, wonderful. Well, we touched on this a little bit. And so I want to dive a little bit more into this idea of the financial barriers, maybe that as small business owners, or perhaps if you're a single woman, have you experienced anything with banks or other lending institutions or financial services where you thought, well, this is not what I expected, or I know my husband never had to deal with this. My father didn't have to deal with it. Anything that comes to mind, either from a business or a personal perspective. No, everybody's had a great relationship with their banker because they had a great.
And how come everybody's using the online small business lenders that then turn out into trouble, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing in the industry, is that there are so many of these fintechs and online lenders. It's so easy. You don't have to provide, you don't have to fill out an application, do much of anything, and you get a chunk of money. But then when the repayment happens, it's at an interest rate, or it's, the payments are just unsustainable. Like, I think there's a lot of opportunity for banks to try to meet in the middle for the great ease of service that those fintechs provide and the access to the capital, but at reasonable rates. And I think other benefit of working with a banker is when you're working with a community banker in particular, they're interested in your success because they benefit from your success. As you grow as a business, you become a bigger customer. You help them succeed as they're helping you succeed. And I think that's the beauty of that banking opportunity and that banking relationship. So I think understanding what your experiences have been critically important so that we can understand how to help banks reach you more effectively and help you more effectively, because that story that you told about 2020, not having any income and that being a barrier, that's heartbreaking, right? Because you're struggling already. Being told that by someone who's there to help you is really deflating. And I think we need to try to get past those barriers, because they don't have to be barriers. There can be ways around those.
Anybody Yancy, you have a particularly experience in this area? It will be shortly. He'll handle it. Yeah.
I'm green. Okay. Well, I will say, with the pharmacy, when COVID hit, it was the Wild West because we couldn't stay home. We had to go to work every day. We worked all day in masks. We had to keep the doors to the pharmacy closed. And we would run every prescription out to the cars, or we delivered to homes or work. So we were delivering and running out to cars, counseling over the phone. But when you think about it, people weren't going to the doctor for like routine visits or going to the dermatologist. So a lot of our business dropped, and our relationship with our local bankers, like you were saying, was instrumental. They came and helped make sure that we were signed up for the paycheck protection loans that so many small businesses were able to utilize. Our community, Russellville, we had some local leaders really step up and make sure that our businesses were aware of them and in the steps to be sure that you completed everything correctly. And so I think that really helped us. But then the vaccines came out, and that was a whole nother Wild West of
everybody's learning together.
Talk about adrenal fatigue, but that relationship with the banker was instrumental for us. And I know a lot of other local businesses it was as well.
Well, I think that goes to, we've talked about, again, as I said in the very beginning of this portion, like there's a lot of talk about what negative things came out of COVID, and we certainly have been negatively impacted, but being able to identify where are those, because I'm aware of banks in Little Rock that help their clients with PPP loans, and I'm aware of banks that did not. Banks that just were not returning phone calls from small businesses in particular because they weren't enough of a big enough fish to worry about. And so that actually gives me some hope about the community that we have here in our cities in Arkansas, and where small bankers in particular have been mindful, and some bigger banks, but mostly smaller banks.
Yes.
Very good. Yeah. Got it. I think this was good.
You hit a hot button when you talked about loan lending. I mean, I can just say, so I was in the wedding industry for 10 years as a photographer, wanted to build a wedding venue, and I knew that it would be successful, but I was talking to a very male dominated banking community, and I worked for 2 years with the Arkansas Small Business and Development Center to build my plan and all these kind of things. And I still had a room where a bunch of guys sat around and said, I don't know, people really spend money on weddings?
They don't have daughters.
I was like, yes, they do, and it didn't matter kind of the statistics and, and they're like, well, this one person did this, the experience they have is, potentially someone who maybe was retired and had a barn and, they did a few weddings and that's all the experience that they had. Not someone who was like, no, this is going to be my full-time job. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to work it, And so I kind of felt like I got patted on the head. But didn't give up. We sold our house and we lived in a single wide trailer and on the property. And my husband worked for 2 years to build it. And then we went back to a different bank and just refinanced it all, is how we did it. We had to get really creative, but that's all the experience I have. I don't know if other female dominated businesses, if your banker at the end of the day doesn't have any experience with what you're doing, I think it's a huge barrier.
Well, I want to break a little bit with tradition. I'm going to ask him, who has worked a lot with entrepreneurs here in Arkansas, just talking about this kind of mirror that we see in investing and where women gain investment for their entrepreneurial activities and where they don't.
First of all, extremely powerful story. Also a success story in the end. I mean, so I work locally with entrepreneurs, but also nationally with female entrepreneurs, and access to capital is like the number one barrier most people will say. And what we see is, and what you said is like so spot on. We hear startups who are in a female space, like female hygiene or something like that. They go pitch to male investors and they're like, I don't know. Is this a problem? I have no idea. I don't want to invest in that because I just don't know the space. And so they have to go to non-traditional forms of funding. What we do see is there aren't enough female investors in the market at all. And that's because there aren't as many females who have had exits from successful companies to be female investors. So in terms of like venture capital, it's sort of like the chicken or the egg. That is one solution, is to have more female investors who would invest in more female-run companies. Another solution is just to have more equity in the kinds of businesses that investors are investing in. But what you said is so spot on. It's like, if you can do all the research that you want and even have market validation and sales, but if you're sitting in a room with people who don't understand what you're doing, they're probably not going to invest.
I want to also talk about, because we're starting to touch on it a little bit, just kind of what you've experienced as barriers to access to health. Really over the last 2 years there's been some very distinct things that we've experienced, right? Some services just were not allowed at hospitals. Surgeries were delayed, things that were not emergent. And now as we come out of it, but also just in general in your life, whether it's access to mental health or resources or traditional health resources, behavioral health resources for yourself, for your children. Does anybody have anything that they want to share or talk about as an experience in that regard? I don't mean to point fingers, but I just realized I haven't talked to Stephanie at all. Do you have any experience on the health aspects? Oh boy, that was good. Oh, hardly.
Well, I think I'll echo some of what Yancey said as far as our community here. We have a lot of great opportunities as far as healthcare providers and people who kept their doors open and were willing to think outside the box as far as ways to provide service within the community. I do think that the telehealth aspect has been really helpful as far as, with our children and being able to, if they do have a need, being able to find a provider that can access through telehealth. That's something that we utilized as a family during the pandemic. So, but in this community, I think that we do have some great opportunities for that.
And did you have enough access to broadband? Did you ever have any challenges where you were at home and either in the early part of the pandemic or at any point in the pandemic, that just wasn't an option for you?
I didn't personally have the experience with not having broadband. We live here in town. And so I know there are a lot of areas here, even students here at Tech who had, used hotspots that they were able to use from the library, because when they went home, they didn't have access to broadband in the more rural areas. So that was something that was a barrier for others. As far as for me and my family, we were able to, our internet was able to support the needs that our kids had for access to that. And we were able to use what we had at home, but I know that wasn't the case for everyone.
Mhm. Anybody have that trouble or any other? You did.
So I care for my elderly parents and in-laws, and they were able to successfully access telehealth. And a big part of the reason is was losing our paper newspapers. Which I love my paper newspaper, but the Democrat Gazette providing the iPads across the state, that really got them into using iPads. And so that they would not have been able to access telehealth if it had been going into a platform on a regular traditional desktop computer, but they had gotten so adept at using the iPad. I should say adept, that might be generous, but they were able to access those telehealth visits when it was critical, and they could not be in person at all. And so that was a big help for our family and hopefully other families in Arkansas.
Yeah, my dad uses his iPad for Candy Crush only, but I have great hopes when he needs it, he'll be able to do telehealth. Bless his heart. Hi, Dad. Anyone willing to share any experiences about mental health and the quality of your mental health during the pandemic in particular?
Before I joined the Chamber of Commerce, I was running CEO of several boys and girls clubs in Russellville, Dardanelle, London. And so during the pandemic, we had to close for the daily childcare. We just stayed open to feed daily. And so when you said the question about health, what I saw is a lot of kids that didn't necessarily need to be at home, going home. And so we saw a lot of that happening. And I think when we closed our schools for a period of time and daycares, it really restricted, I think, a lot of kids in a certain demographics access to health, because their access to health was through the schools or through or even services provided at a childcare center like Pediatrics Plus or something like that. I mean, but there was a period of time when we were back in school and not accessing telehealth, that when the school would quarantine classrooms for COVID, those children were not receiving services, or our children that we sent home from the Boys and Girls Club were at home and, definitely not getting the healthcare quality that they would have received with a teacher checking up on them or in the school system, and then had limited access to nutrition as well. So I just think that all of that, we are seeing a large group of kids then come back into school in 2021. That was, I think, very interesting for us to see in our Boys and Girls Clubs of kids that had been home, and it was almost trauma. I mean, it's almost like they coming out of trauma, and we had to deal with that. And there were a lot of programs on the state level and a lot of neat things locally that happened. But I think that the mental health of our kiddos that were at home within a certain demographic really, I think that's good that we're having these conversations and talking about that.
Yeah, and Beverly touched on this a little bit about the work of the COVID-19 committee, and I think we're seeing this in terms of child abuse or neglect, as well as the number of reports that went down during COVID, which is a false indication of what was really happening, right? Which is that those incidences were actually on the rise. And so how do we, and I say we, meaning government, policymakers, how do we figure out how to address that when we don't have the data to back it up? And so it's really, so your anecdotes like that are very important for us as we kind of make recommendations around that. So we just have a few more minutes. And so I just want to open it up to anyone who has not said what they wanted to say about a barrier or a challenge that they've experienced that they'd want the committee to take serious consideration of.
One more thing to say. So I think in all of the conversations that I've had over the past few days with all of these amazing Arkansans that are Kansans, sorry,
right.
I hate to emphasize Kansas there, but that I've been, oh, is that right? Okay. I'm gonna stick with Arkansans, but I think one of the most important things that I've learned in this job and as a community banker is that without financial education in our schools and helping kids understand what it means to have access to capital, to have an understanding of how you build wealth from an early age, and to have someone in your life that can serve as a role model for what's possible. It's not possible to break generational trends. And it's not necessarily just the job of bankers to educate kids about how that happens. A lot of times it happens in your family, or if you have a role model who's in industry, but that's only if you're lucky enough to have that contact or communication. So I hope that there can be some opportunity for a better understanding to help children as they're learning to understand that foundational element of the importance of a financial education going through their lives. Because without that understanding that you can create your own business, you just have to have access to the information that will help you make the right decisions to get there. But if you don't even know that that's an opportunity or a choice, I think that's where we lose our children at that point.
Great. That's, I think that's wonderful. We actually have a program here in Arkansas called Economics Arkansas that does children's financial education. And they do this great competition every year of like, I think it's fifth graders. If somebody knows, tell me differently, but I feel like it's like third to fifth graders or so. And they come up with business plans and pitches and how to teach other children about financial literacy. So it's really wonderful. All right. I promise to start on time and end on time, and I'm going to do just that. I'm going to first turn it over to Senator Davis for a few remarks.
Auditor Andrea Lee just sends her regrets. She got stuck in April's meeting that went long, and she's a commissioner. And so I wanted to say this, since it was here in her hometown, she was really disappointed she couldn't be here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. We miss her in her absence. So I want to thank all of our special guests and to Arkansas Tech for welcoming us here. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, your hospitality, your hometown with us. Good luck with the remainder of the first day of classes. And with that, let me just say this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.